Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening already. Thank you for joining. Hopefully, you have fun tonight. Before we start, we have to thank Leap for allowing us to come here, and then we just go directly to the presentation of today. Thomas is going to do the presentation, as you can see about testing. What I can say about Thomas, he loves cats, he told me, and he works in the same company as I do in Bimacom.
Yes.
You are actually Java, and now it's more AngularJS. We did together two meetups presentation about mastering scope, and today you're going to talk about mastering unit testing. Yeah, hopefully you have fun. We can interrupt you at any moment, I guess.
Yeah, of course, like questions are accepted, of course, and welcomed, and of course then at the end there will be like some question and answer session. Okay. But if you have like some really question on top of your mind, then don't hesitate and ask me, no problem.
Perfect. So yeah, let's start. Thank you for doing the presentation.
Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. So hi guys, let's go. My name is Thomas, and I will tell today about the proper unit testing of AngularJS applications with EcmaScript 6 modules. So
is it working?
Hopefully. So a little bit about me. So my name is Thomas, software engineer at Bimacom, as Carlos said, and yeah, before I was working mostly with Java backend services, but then I switched to JavaScript and AngularJS like maybe 2 years ago, and since then I was really going in depth because it's a really interesting piece of technology and it allows you to do quite a lot, and yeah, all the hype, and JavaScript is like much better to work with collections and data, so it was like an easy choice for me to switch. So, this presentation will be about the unit testing of AngularJS applications. So, I hope you guys are testing your Angular applications, or who is writing tests here in this audience? One. Okay, that's good. That's really good. So, you know that's really important to write tests if you are working in a team of more than one person, because then nobody knows everything, and if you want to refactor anything, then it comes in handy. And if you have written some of the tests, then you know that it's actually like not that easy to write them in Angular in particular. So there's like a lot of Angular API involved, and yeah, maybe there is a better way to do it. But first, so I would like to tell you a story. So why I came up like with this concept of unit testing. The thing is, actually, I am working right now at the customer on a project, and it's actually the biggest project up to date for me. And that means there's like two big applications actually. One is the AngularJS portal, and the second one is like a reusable Node.js logic, which can be embedded in the portal, which means like if you go with the browser, if I create a bundle with it and then wrap it as Angular service, or then the second mode of operation is that it is like a isolated Node.js backend application, so it exposes the same API with the REST interface. And in this project, so like there was a really big discrepancy between how much it takes to run the tests. As you can see, like on the first project we had more than 1,100 tests, and it took like around 157 seconds. But in the second project we have more than 6,000 tests, and it took just like 32 seconds. And I'm speaking about like the developer station, and then on the continuous integration server, actually at the customer they had like a slow machine, so it took even like 10 minutes for the first project and then like 3 minutes for the second. So it was completely insane. And of course you want to run those tests quite often because you want to check if you broke something after your colleagues, or maybe not, but maybe they broke something and you want to know what, so you can fix it really fast. So for me it was like, why? I didn't really understand that. And that was what made me go a little bit deeper. So what I was thinking about, like, of course, it must have something to do with the stack or the environment or like the framework we are using, or like why? What's the deal? Because like let's say like the 5 times more tests take 5 times less time. And the thing was that actually this first project, which is, as I said, like there was AngularJS portal, so it's like a standard stack. So AngularJS actually version 1.4, then Grunt for the build process, Karma and Jasmine for the tests, and we run those tests in Chrome. Also, we tried like with the PhantomJS, but actually there we got into problems like with memory, because there's so many tests were run together. Then we tried to like split the test tasks, so like it was like Karma 1 to 10, so we just run a subset of tests in one PhantomJS instance, but then again it still wasn't working, so we switched to Chrome. But in the second project was like just node, as I said, node modules, again like build process with Grunt and test run with Mocha and JS assertion library. So yeah, of course it was these times were dependent on the stack used and libraries, but the question was like, why is it like this? Because I really didn't know in the beginning. So let's now speak a little bit about the standard way of testing AngularJS. So as you said, most of you have written a lot of tests, so you are familiar with using Karma test runner and Jasmine, I suppose, because this is like actually, well, if you just try to Google like how to test AngularJS, then what you came up with Google is that people are doing like this. So this is like a simple example of a standard test you can find. So you already seen that, the iconic module, so you have to require the module like as the first thing to do. Then you may or may not mock something using $provide. Then you need to get reference to the functionality you want to test. So for example, for this to-do service, and after that you can test. So yeah. But where's still like the question wasn't answered, like what's the catch, why it takes so much time? Then I dig a bit deeper. So as Carlos said, I have like a background in Java development, and you may be aware that in Java there's like one of the most popular framework is the Spring framework, and one of the most popular features of the Spring framework is the dependency injection and the container which it has. And there's like this concept of application contexts with the instantiated beans, and yeah, so this is how you run the application actually in the Spring. And this made me thinking that actually Angular is doing something really similar to it, and that yeah, I called it Angular context, which is like a initialized Angular dependency injection mechanism. And you all know it, because it's, so yeah, actually how it works in Angular, dependency injection mechanism in Angular works by registering all your functionality into Angular global objects. So you know, like all the files you have been ever writing, if you are not using the modules, started something like this. So firstly you need the reference to global Angular object, which is present in the browser, maybe included with a script or somehow else. And then you use like .module, so you can get the reference to already existing module, or you can declare a new module. And after that, you can register your functionality such as controller, directive, service provider. Maybe it's one per file, maybe you put more of them in one file. But then this is the standard way of doing things. And why is it like this? So again, not completely sure, but what I suppose why they did it like that is that when they started to develop AngularJS, the JavaScript development environment wasn't yet that mature as it's now. So there wasn't that many build options available. There weren't like module bundlers yet. I suppose the browserify wasn't there yet when they started with Angular, or maybe it was like really in the beginning. So the most of the builds of JavaScript at that time were like just a concatenation of the files. To do that, they need to wrap all your functionality in the IFI, so like they immediately execute function expression, so that you don't pollute your global scope in the browser. And usually, what you did was to hang everything on just like one variable in the global scope, so that you create like for yourself a namespace. So this were around like when Angular was beginning. And now, like, how does the Angular context actually look like in the wild? So again, like the example of the first test which we showed before. So every test actually, what you do in the beginning is to get a reference to the module. So it can be called main, can be called like my application, like some specific application name. And what it does is actually it starts the Angular application for you. So it's the similar thing as what happens if you are using ng-app in the template, or if you are doing like manual bootstrapping in the script tag yourself or somewhere else. So this is always before every test you actually need to instantiate the whole Angular application. Okay, maybe not all, maybe you can use just some sub-modules if you have them, but then again you have to start it up. And this is so you can get the reference actually to the objects you want to test. So let's say like a service or a controller. Like the mocking there is optional. But the thing is, like, you have to do it, and after you did this, then you can actually proceed with some testing. And this is like for the services, so this is the most simple example. But let's look what happens with the controller. So there is even more Angular. Oh, So in the case of controller, it gets even worse. So if you want to actually get a reference to the controller you've written and registered in Angular, you had at least to inject $controller. Maybe not root scope. If you are using controller as syntax, then you don't have to create a new scope and instantiate your controller with the scope. But still, you need at least $controller Angular API to get the reference to your controller so that you can test it actually. Because without it, without running Angular application and this $controller, you have no way to access this function, which is a controller of yours. And the last example is the directives. That's the worst possible, yes. So again, here you actually cannot skip the part with the root scope and creating of the new scope. You also need the $compile. Then you can create like element with inline HTML template with your directive attribute. And you can compile it. And you can then you must digest it, and then you can actually get some references to some objects in the directive template, and then trigger some events on it, and maybe something will happen. So that's quite crazy, I would say, because like the directive also has a controller or link function, which is just like some logic, which should be testable in the normal way and not doing this crazy stuff. And what about the profiler? So I try to I run those tests in a Chrome with Karma, and then you have this like debugger option, and I went to see the profiler, and it looked like that I don't know if it's like too much opacity here, but it's like this fire chart, and all this stuff was like about spinning up and tearing down Angular application, and just here was actually like I did like with the magnifying glass, there's expect executes here. So there's quite a lot of overhead with this before each like module main and inject and so on, or like with the creation of controllers and all the objects in this like Angular dependency injection container, so that you can get through this.
Thomas, I guess this is only for one test, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So every test is doing.
Don't know if it's like.
Well,
yes, I suppose yes.
Actually, you're doing before each. So every test that you're running,
should spin up new Angular application. Yes. So it's quite a lot, and this is why like those 1,000 tests versus 6,000 tests, it started to make some sense, yeah. And then okay, so let's summarize it. Like, what are the main points of this Angular context and how it relates to testing? So the thing was, as I said, is that you have to instantiate your AngularJS application just to get a reference to your controller or service or directive which you actually want to test. Without it, if you are writing it standardly, you actually have no access to this logic. There is no like getter function inside of Angular which you can just get access to raw service or factory functions. There is no way to do it if you are writing it standardly. Then second point is that even when you get like reference, it's hard to get reference to, like, let's say directives controller. That you can do like a workaround to it, so you actually register the directives controller as a controller inside Angular. So you just use like angular.module.controller, and then you define this controller, and then you reference it in the directive with the string of like the name of the controller, so like with the string. This is possible, but then again, do we want to do it? Like, do we want to expose the controller into the whole application if it just belongs to directive? So it's like not doing as workaround. Then like another thing is that actually when we want to run those tests in Karma, then we have to do like the Karma context, so we have to include Angular, Angular mocks, and all the libraries you are using, so like NGAnimate, Angular Web Bootstrap, all those libraries has to be included, has to be loaded in the browser on the startup, so it also takes some time, of course, and maintenance. And fourth, like the Angular context can grow quite large. So as we shown at the beginning, there is like this before each module my app, and this is like this application, and if you have like 3 controls and 10 services, okay, but if you have like 300 controllers and 500 services, which can happen in some crazy portals, then yeah, this can be problematic. Of course, you can argue that actually you can split application into submodules, which is true, of course, but in practice, which I saw in most projects, people don't really do that, like they don't have that much discipline about it. And then again, like what about testing like some cross-project infrastructure, like I don't know, logging or I don't know, like HTTP interceptors and stuff like that. So it's really not that easy to depend on the fact that developers will split the Angular application in really encapsulated small modules. It's possible, but it's just not usual, let's say. So how can we get around this? How can we make it run fast? How can we make it simpler? And here comes like the EcmaScript 6 modules, or actually, like you can see, it's like in the colors with the stars. So it's actually, it doesn't matter what kind of modules you will use. Like any modules we do, that means like also like the common JS, or like with require, like the standard Node.js syntax, and then the browser require or webpack, or it can be like with the AND with the browser also. So it doesn't matter which kind of modules you will use, but then you can actually do this unit testing stuff. And like yeah, for me, like what makes the most sense right now is to use this EcmaScript 6 or 2015, that is the new name because it was released this summer. And yeah, so I really prefer this syntax. I suppose all of you have seen that. Have all of you worked with this like new JavaScript syntax of the import export? Or how many of you? So some. So those who don't, that actually. So then again, like who worked with the common JS, which is like a Node.js environment, so like you always like require, okay, some others. So yeah, so this is like a new syntax for it, where you can do like imports and exports. You can do like some nice stuff there, maybe come to it back later. So it's like a module syntax. So what are the key features of those modules which will help us to implement this unit testing? Is that your implementation, which is like, let's say one service, one file, or one controller, one file, or one directive, one file, is encapsulated in that file. So the file only exposes what is explicitly exported, and also explicitly imported dependencies are declared. And this means like those modules are not supported natively yet in the browsers, so we always have to use them with some module bundlers. That means, like for example, the browserify or webpack. And what these module bundlers do is that they have like some entry point, and then they go through the dependency tree through those explicit import and export statements, and they actually wrap and concatenate all these files. And because they are wrapped in functions, then you get like the isolated scopes. So you don't put it your global namespace, and also when it's wrapped, they get their like IDs, so you can then just get like reference to the content of one file. This is what we are aiming for. But then, like, the one thing which is interesting to note is that if we are using it like this, that means that we have actually like two dependency injections like mechanism in one application, because we are still using Angular, which is still global objects, which in which we still have to register our functionality, but plus we have those modules which in itself are not like really dependency injection mechanism, but in combination with module bundlers like browserify, which grabs it and then injects correct functionality in the correct place by those IDs that actually is dependency injection, which you have not that much control about. So if we compare it, so if we compare it, in Angular, how it works, you have a global object, which is like a namespace Angular, where you register everything with some specific vendor-specific Angular API, like controller, provider, factory, and so on. It's concat friendly, if you write it like that. It's framework specific, and it's hard to get reference to your functionality. And compared to the ECMA6 modules, which is like a transparent DA wrapper, that means those module bundlers do it for you, don't really care. It's just, you know, like the content of the file is isolated, and you can get access to it, the content of the file anywhere you want. That's the main point. Also, of course, it's a standard syntax, it's a part of the language right now, so it's not going anywhere. Also, like TypeScript adopted this syntax, so it will be used in the near future more and more, supposedly. Again, it's like concat friendly because bundlers doesn't do it for you. It's framework agnostic, and it's easy to get the reference to the functionality. So how can we use it? Let's check an example of a proper unit test of AngularJS application. So as you can see, in the first line I'm importing like this chai assertion framework, which is not needed. And then so this is like a test file. And what I have to do is import the service, which is factory function, so I just have to execute it. If it was like a service, then I have to new it, or if it was a class, I can new it, and then I can test it, and that's all. Like no Angular API, nothing is involved. Yes.
Actually, keep the same thing, which is like the first version, which you separate the files, like services and modules in different files, and you use like Angular based on this browser like that.
Okay, but like you have to split the registration into Angular from implementation. So here you can, like as I said, like with any module system. Also with the common JS, yes. But the point is that you split the implementation of the functionality from registering it to Angular context. But we will get to that hopefully. So as you saw, this was just like a pure unit test. No Angular API involved. No need to spin up Angular application, no need to instantiate AngularJS context and stuff, so just pure test. So how can we do it? So this is like an example of the service, like a very simple example. The to-do service, we have some like state inside and constant, and we return some public interface, which is using the enhanced object literal. So normally we would do like return todos, double point todos, but because it's enhanced object literal, we don't have to write it. Then we have some functionality, so it's like the implementation of service. And what is important is, as you can see, there's like this export default function, so we are exporting it from the file. And then in a second file, you will register it into the Angular. So those are like two separated files. We import the service and register it into the Angular. And of course, like you can do it also like with the older module bundlers or older module syntax. But the key point was to separate it and to run those tests without instantiating the Angular context. And then maybe a subjective preference, but from my point of view, like this combination of testing tools is just easier to work with than Karma and Jasmine. At least, like, what I think is really great about Mocha is the great support for asynchronous test. So what you actually need to do in Mocha is just return promise from any testing block. So let's say like before each or it should do something, and you just return the promise, and then the execution will wait until the promise was resolved, and then you can do the assertions in the then handler, which works automatically. If you compare it to Jasmine, so the version 1.x was complete disaster because then you have to do like those special blocks like runs and wait fors and create yourself a boolean flags until it's done. In the version 2 it got a little bit better because you actually get a reference to done function in every test, so you can call like the done function then in the handler, but then again still not that great from my point of view. Like the asynchronous testing with the Mocha is really most convenient and like most productive for a developer. Also like usually used with JS assertion framework, which provides some quite nice utility methods like deep equals and stuff, so you get like more than just asserts. Also there exists like a library JS promised, which provides you with the syntax for like asynchronous testing in a BDD way. So like you do some test some promise, and then you can do like assertion to eventually be equal or stuff like this. And then like of course that was a unit test, but what if our services have some dependencies then, which is usually the case. So it's never just like, okay, maybe sometimes it is, but usually your services cooperate to provide some more complex use cases. So how can you do it? One way of doing it, like proper unit testing, would be to mock all the dependencies. For this we can use library Synon.js. So as you can see, I actually import the service again. In this test I'm testing the to-do component. It's like Angular 1 directive, which uses to-do service. So I import the to-do component and to-do service, and then I use the Synon mock to-do service, and then after which I restore it. And what you actually can do is then execute some functionality in the component and prove that everything which should have been called was called. So it's like a proper unit test. Maybe not that useful, but some people prefer that. Or more interesting, what you can do is actually like small scale manual integration testing. So again, like the same situation, we have like three things. We have the to-do component, which uses to-do service, which needs initial totals, to-dos. So in before each block I can specify all of this. So I create initial to-dos, which is just an empty array. Then I can create an instance of to-do service with those initial to-dos, and then last step I instantiate to-do component with already initialized to-do service, and then I can test it. Again, no Angular, and yeah, so let's say like if you don't have that many tests, it doesn't really matter, but if you go into those numbers like in thousands, you will see like a dramatic improvement in performance. So and what about like the proper integration test? Then of course we are getting back to Karma Jasmine, because they're really good at one thing, which is instantiating the whole Angular application and instantiating all the services and mocking them like with the $provide functionality. So if you want to do like some bigger flows, or yeah, actually test like some UI-related stuff like directives, then of course this is the way to go. Also, like if you want to test some like infrastructural services like login or interceptor, which really needs like the Angular API to be present and working, then this is the way to go, of course. But just like for testing of functionality, that's much faster. So that's basically it. So what we have been through is like what is the standard way of testing AngularJS applications? What does it actually mean when you do it like in a standard way? Like what is this AngularJS context? How the Karma and Jasmine use this context so that you can actually get a reference to the objects you want to test. Why it takes so much time. Then how you can use modules like the new ones or the old ones to separate the implementation from registering into AngularJS context, so that you can get the reference to your functionality without AngularJS application, so that you can test it fast. and how can you use like karma adjustment common for integration tests. So, and then maybe I can show you really fast. I did like an example GitHub repository. Okay. Yeah, I'm not a Mac person. Yeah, I need my mouse. You know.
We don't need mouses, you know.
Like it. It's like a different path, I suppose.
Yeah,
Got lost.
Which one is new? Which one is the one you use to change?
I like okay, you can open this one. You can open it here. Yeah, okay. And now I'll open control the screen. That was the main problem.
No,
It's not that easy, no? But then, like, of course, there will be like links to presentation, the GitHub repository, also like with the example project, and actually, like, there's also like written a blog post about it. So usually, like my process is that, like, if I encounter like some interesting topic, like based on my work experiences, then I research it a bit, and then write a blog post, and like if people find it interesting, then I may or may not do like some presentation. But this one was quite okay. You can also do it, yeah. Oh, cool. Perfect, thank you. So actually there's like example GitHub repository when there is like a very small example like small AngularJS application I can actually show it to you. So it's like really simple. There's like two features, feature A and feature B. And then I employed like using component function that means like the views are like actually always wrapped as directives. And like here we have some really interesting functionality like a counter which we can increment. And this is actually been tested with these like unit testing ways. So it's actually like it's called like the sum component, and you can see like I import it here and then I test like this counter functionality. And feature B, which is like a small to-do application. So here we have to-dos, we can switch their state, we can remove done to-dos, and we can add some new ones. And then again, there's like 3 different types of tests written for it in this repository. Okay. So the first one is like the simplest one, so we just get the reference to the service instantiated and write some tests. And the second one is actually like the Asynchronous, so we are testing the component with the mock service that everything was called as we suppose. And the third one is that we actually instantiate the service and then inject it into the component and then do like a real small scale integration testing. In the repository, I just opened it. So actually this example uses Webpack, also like for the running of the project, for building it, and also for running of the tests. But actually like for those unit tests you don't need anything, because you can just use like in the npm you have the possibility to use scripts, and there is like the script named test which just runs the mocha which was installed like as npm development dependency. You using the just Mocha available because the examples are in EcmaScript 6, and it just runs the test like really fast and can be thousands of tests. And also there is like a Karma for integration testing. So go back. For Karma, I'm using the Webpack configuration. So I Karma together with the Webpack, and then it like includes like I don't even remember to do it. I just read in some blog how to do it. But if you can do it like you have the possibility to do both. Maybe it's too small. Maybe it's too capital. So, but yeah, you can do it like both ways, and then like do like for if I'm writing some service and there is some logic, of course I want to test this logic and don't need the whole application for it. But if I want to test everything, then I can. And then like in the source, so go to feature B, and then you can write services. Or is this for the control? And here we have like actually the Karma test, like real Karma test. So it's possible. No, it's not. Sorry, it's not. I'm not doing it somewhere else. I don't remember where I found it somewhere there. Okay. So that's it. And I will put the presentation link into the meetup page, so in the comment. Then you can check out the presentation, the repository, and also the original blog post. So now for the questions.
I have one.
Yes.
Do you try to migrate from one to the other? If yes, what are the best steps?
Oh, okay, I see. So the thing is, like, the most important step in doing this is actually to separate your functionality, like, so the implementation from registering into Angular context into separate files. That's the most important. Actually, it doesn't have to be even two separated files if I think about it, just have to export the functionality. So like the service or the factory function has to be exported so you can get reference to it. But if it's separated, then you don't have to have, like, yeah, it's better to separate it, because if you don't separate it, then there might be some errors because there is no Angular available if you are just running it with the Mocha directly from the node. So actually it's best to separate it. So the first step would be to really separate the implementation and registering in two different files. And for that, of course, if you didn't use that before, you need to introduce a module bundler into your project, so that's without it doesn't really work. And then if you separate it, that's all you need to do. Actually just separate it. So introduce the module bundler and then start separating the functionality into separate files, and then you can just start writing such tests. Because you just require the functionality like this. And yeah, of course, like this is more important like in really bigger projects, I would say, where the time starts to make some sense. Yes?
Speaking of bigger projects and masochism, is this a pure JavaScript project or are you using the language?
The one which I'm working right now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's just JavaScript because, you know, it's like, so actually it's in the Mobilia, and I and my colleague are there just like as a consultant, so we have only so much limited influence. So actually this second one, which I spoke about, like not the Angular portal, but those reusable node module logic, it was a smaller one, so there we actually managed to introduce TypeScript. And that was like a good thing to do, of course. I wanted to do it also into the bigger one, but we couldn't. Also, we couldn't introduce like the EcmaScript 6 or modules or module bundlers like impossible, unfortunately. And this is why the test takes so much. Besides other things, of course. Yes?
Yeah, there's something I don't quite get with EcmaScript 6 or modules and AngularJS. If you can import anything anywhere, then you don't need dependency injection anymore. What's the boundaries?
Again, please.
If you can import anything anywhere, then you don't really need dependency injection anymore. What's the boundaries of why should you keep using dependency injection?
Actually, I agree with you. Like I'm working right now on a new article which is like vanilla pattern for AngularJS. So like how to do it like actually without it, because like the biggest benefit of AngularJS was the structure of the code. So you got like this API to register stuff, and then this made you separate your logic into controllers and services and directives, which was really nice. And of course also in the environment without modules, it was necessary to manage like a bigger projects. Now it's actually like redundant. As I said, like there are two dependency injection mechanism in place. Still can make some sense because it enables you to like use some other implementation, like with this $provide, for example. So you can dynamically switch what you want to use. But then again, there are things like proxy quire, which enables you to do the same just with the pure module. So it's not really that of a big benefit. Then again, like in Angular 2.0, they will do new dependency injection like mechanism. But this like Angular 2.0 is with TypeScript by default and with modules and imports and exports. But there, what they can do is actually like more in a Java direction, so you can decide what you want to inject based on some environment variables or something like that, for example. It's more like in the Java direction. So it still has its place, because it can be like quite clumsy to work like with some workarounds and that around require, because like requiring is like compile time. But then again, like dependency injection can be also like during runtime. So when you are building some new service dynamically based on some conditions. So it's still has its place, but it's not that usual use case, definitely. Very good question. Yes?
If I understand the whole concept correctly, it's all about speeding up tests and
Yes.
lighting out certain layers, like not loading Angular at all.
Exactly.
But if I look at my code and then what you use for stuff is controllers being so close to the UI, I end up quite often having functions using Angular functions themselves, like isString, isNumber, and such.
Okay.
Or in services also using Angular JQuery or adding HTTP access. So these are all references coming from Angular.
Of course.
Now, am I just doing something wrong here? Like separating libraries, I should do better than that? Or how do you cope with this kind of situation? What to do with controllers that actually are built upon Angular?
Okay, so that's like an interesting question. The thing is, like last year, let's say, there was like a big movement towards using as less Angular API as possible, mainly because the Angular 2.0 completely deprecates everything. So actually the movement was towards just using all the logic like pure JavaScript functions without relying on Angular API, mainly because of the future migration path to Angular 2.0. For that, they provide tools like, let's say, controller as syntax. It can be in roots or in directives. And what this does is actually you don't need scope anymore, for example, but you can, like that data which is bound directly on control is then available in template. It's like one of examples, so you don't need scope, first thing. For those like helper functions, mainly people use like, let's say, lodash or underscore, because this is also more likely here to stay, because like Angular 1.x syntax was already deprecated in that manner. For the HTTP services, there is like a pattern when you have like services with logic, and then you have like integration or REST services, which implements only the REST calls and nothing else. So you can again like isolate it from your logic. So, and then what happened was that you actually ended up with your real logic being like pure functions, like those services. And this is also why. And maybe like one last thing, with this logic being like pure and not dependent on Angular 1.x API, then it's much easier to migrate, because like for example with controller, you can just like remove this registration API and take like a new Angular 2.0 annotations and create a component out of it, but the functionality stays the same. Something like this. Anything else?
Do I really understand that you shouldn't use Angular components like agents?
Not really shouldn't, but like isolate it, which is also always, it's always good to separate your concerns. So for example, if I have like a controller, which like in my experience what works the best is if the controller is really thin, so it just delegates the functionality to the service, like just calls the service, appropriate service. And then service does some transformations or like executes some logic. And then if you want to persist it or load data, then you call like integration service, which is just specialized for this implements those REST calls. And then there is actually nothing to test because it doesn't do anything, just implements those REST calls. And then you separate your logic in the services, which has nothing to do with Angular API. So that's the one way to do it, of course.
How do you mean the separation service? Like I take HTTP reference to a service.
So it's more like I have like, let's say we have like the to-do domain, and we have to-do component, which is like a UI directive. And this directive has a controller, and this controller injects to-do service, and to-do service injects to-do integration service. So if I create, so then from the component I can call like add to-do with the new text, let's say, and in to-do service I create this object and call integration service to persist it.
The idea is to throw away this work afterwards.
Yes. And actually I found like lately there is like this Axion library which is modeled directly after $HTTP, but it's without it, so you can just like record as a dependency, and it has the same API. You can do like the interceptors, like it's the same. It's just nothing to do with Angular.
And for queue,
Again?
for queue,
So you can, you can use like the native promises, but it's not like that well supported yet. Or there's like the queue without dollar actually, and also Bluebird, which is really cool because they have like some really powerful functions which are not available in $queue, for example. So yeah.
why should I use Angular?
That's actually a question which I started asking myself after this. Actually. And right now I'm like trying all those libraries. Yeah. So actually, right now I'm like in process of writing like such an example where. So the only thing you need that Angular for is the UI layer, because there you get like really nice directives, templates, binding, and so on. And these you can switch for React. But I mean, like I like Angular. It's really productive for developers, but the landscape has changed. And this is why they are developing Angular 2.0, which is completely different than Angular 1.x, because the landscape has changed so dramatically, and they realized this is why they did such a dramatic changes, so be up to date. And in my point of view, like from my experiences right now, the Angular 2.0, I feel more productive with Angular 2.0 than with React, because React is too low level. You have some libraries, but then again, like it's really like a wild west there. Releases here and there, and like compatibility, yeah, maybe, no, I don't know. So actually, I suppose when they release Angular 2.0, it will be polished and really work well together. It will be like the highest possible productivity achieved.
The React will evolve as well. So by the time
Again, please.
React will evolve as well. So by the time Angular 2 is released, as well.
Yeah, but React is still.
Next, that will be as nice.
Yeah, but React is still just like for a view layer. Okay, you can say like there's like a relay and GraphQL and so on, and then the red like Flux libraries like Redux and so on. Of course, this may be possible. But yeah, then I mean like people are already like used to stuff like ng repeat directives, and so they already know the concepts. Like the syntax will be a little bit different now. But yeah, I suppose like also they did like the ng upgrade. So you can actually start like migrating step by step. So I think it can be like the highest achievable productivity in a project. But yeah, we will see in the future, nobody knows. But yeah, that was like really, really great question there, like why to actually use Angular. Yeah, I also came up with that. So,
Good. No more questions? Okay, so thank you very much.
No, thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed.
Good. That's it. We're going to be here around 9, so it's around 30 minutes more, and we go. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming and thank you for